When my mother passed away, I thought I had prepared myself for the grief, for the hollow emptiness that comes when someone you love more than the world is suddenly gone. But nothing could have prepared me for the silence that filled our house afterward, the quiet that was heavier than any sound I had ever known. Because even in the quiet moments, I could feel the absence of her laughter, her gentle voice calling out to us, the small habits that had filled the corners of every room with warmth. And I remember walking through the hallways that first morning after her funeral, touching the banister she always polished, glancing at the photographs that captured moments of joy, moments that now felt painfully distant. And I wanted to cry, but found that my tears were trapped somewhere deep inside me because grief had not yet fully settled into my body. It was still raw and tender, still a shock that left me feeling unmoored, as if I were floating in a world where the rules I had always known no longer applied. And I watched my siblings as they went about their morning routines, quiet, withdrawn, each carrying their own sorrow in a way that seemed to create invisible walls between us. Walls that I had never noticed when she was alive, walls that seemed to grow taller with every glance, with every unspoken word. And I remember trying to start a conversation, trying to bring some light, some shared memory, but it felt like my voice bounced off invisible barriers, like it never truly reached them. And I could feel the tension, the hesitation, a strange caution in their eyes, a subtle reminder that grief manifests differently, and sometimes it manifests in ways that make people distant from each other rather than closer. And I wanted so badly to reach out, to touch their hands, to remind them that we were still family, that we still had each other. But every attempt I made was met with polite nods, with silence, with small smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. And I remember the moment my oldest brother said quietly, almost to himself, that we needed to figure things out regarding the house and the money and the things Mom left behind. And it felt like a knife cutting through the last fragile threads that kept us together, because nothing in that moment reminded me of love. Nothing reminded me of comfort. Nothing reminded me of the woman who had spent her life teaching us how to care for each other. And instead, there was a sudden coldness, a sharp edge to the reality that after Mom was gone, so much of what held us together seemed to vanish. And I remember retreating to my room, sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at her favorite chair by the window, wondering how one person's death could undo the bonds that felt so unbreakable. And I thought about all the memories we had shared, all the laughter and tears and quiet nights, and yet in that silence, I could hear the faintest echoes of tension, the first murmurs of disagreements that I hadn't expected, the subtle competitions for acknowledgement, for what she had left, for the invisible claim on her attention that she had given us freely when she was alive. And I realized, with a heavy weight settling in my chest, that grief wasn't just sorrow, it was a test, a challenge. And sometimes it revealed truths we had never faced, things about our relationships, about ourselves that we had ignored or overlooked for far too long. And I could feel my own emotions twisting inside me, confusion, anger, sadness, longing, all rolled into one indistinguishable knot. And I remember the moment I saw my sister walk past my room door, her shoulders stiff, her expression guarded, and I wanted to call out to her to tell her that I loved her and that it was going to be okay. But my throat closed up, my words stuck like pebbles in my mouth, and instead I watched her walk away, and a little piece of me broke, the kind of small fracture that doesn't announce itself but quietly spreads through your heart, making you question whether closeness is something you are ever truly allowed to keep. And I remember lying back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember how it had been before Mom died, when we were children laughing over breakfast, when we shared jokes, when arguments faded quickly into hugs and apologies, when the world felt safer, warmer, like it was held together by her presence. And now all of that seemed distant, unreachable, a kind of dream that had ended abruptly, leaving us to navigate the cold and unfamiliar reality that remained. And I could hear the clock ticking, each second a reminder that time moved forward, that life demanded we keep going, that sorrow would not wait for us to be ready. And I remember the first time I felt resentment rise inside me, subtle at first, a little thought like, why can't they see that I am hurting too? Why are they moving on? Why does everything feel so wrong when all we want is to be together? And I caught myself and swallowed it down, because I knew Mom wouldn't have wanted that. She would have reminded me that love is patient, that understanding is stronger than judgment. And yet, even with that knowledge, my chest ached, my heart felt hollow, and the house felt impossibly large and empty, as though it had grown overnight in her absence. And I kept replaying the moments at the funeral, the faces of my siblings, their careful manners, their polite words, their subtle glances at the will and the house, and I could feel something shifting, something I had not expected, a tension that was quietly building beneath our skin, beneath the words, beneath the polite facades, and I knew instinctively that nothing would ever be quite the same, that our family, which had been held together by love and shared history, was starting to fracture in ways that even she could not have foreseen. And I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to remember how to feel safe, how to feel loved, how to feel like the little girl she used to comfort with her hands on my head. But all I could feel was the hollowness of absence, the quiet tick of the clock, the growing distance between us, and the knowledge that grief had arrived, but so had something else, a subtle, creeping fracture between the people who had once been my whole world. And as the hours passed that day, I could feel the subtle shifts in our home, the way the sunlight fell differently across the living room, as if it too was aware that something had changed. And I wandered from room to room, touching the surfaces my mother had touched, noticing the faint smell of her perfume lingering in the hallway, the small stack of her favorite books on the shelf, the kitchen still holding her imprint in every corner. And yet it all felt like a reminder that she was gone, and that we were left to navigate a life that suddenly felt heavier and colder. And I tried to call out to my siblings to ask how they were feeling, to break through the invisible walls that separated us, but each attempt felt awkward, strained, and ended with silence or a polite nod. And the polite nods stung more than any angry words could, because they carried with them the weight of distance, of unspoken judgments, of competing griefs that none of us could articulate. And I remember sitting on the couch, hugging my knees to my chest, watching my sister walk past the window, and noticing the way she avoided looking at me, the way she carried herself with a strange tension that I had never seen before. And I realized that grief was not the same for any of us, that it could twist love into frustration, patience into irritation, and memories into silent weapons that divided rather than united. And I tried to speak, tried to reach out to remind her that I still loved her and that I was still her sister. But my words felt small, fragile, and ineffective, like whispers lost in a storm. And I began to understand that mourning our mother was not only about missing her presence, but also about seeing the hidden fractures between us that her love had always masked. That even in life, she had been the glue holding the pieces together. And now that she was gone, we were left with nothing but the raw edges of our personalities and our unhealed insecurities. And I could feel the first real pangs of resentment bubbling inside me, the subtle thought that perhaps my siblings were thinking only of themselves, only of what they wanted, only of what they felt entitled to. And yet, I chastised myself immediately because I knew she would want us to hold each other, to forgive, to remember, to stay together even in sorrow. And I could hear her voice in my head reminding me to breathe, to be gentle, to see beyond my own pain to theirs. And in that moment, I felt both the crushing weight of grief and a small flicker of determination, a desire not to let her absence destroy the bond she had spent a lifetime nurturing. And I sat there, letting the silence settle around me, the quiet moments stretching long and deep, noticing the small ways my siblings avoided eye contact, the subtle stiffness in their gestures, the way my brother's hands clenched slightly when he thought no one was looking. And I realized that this was only the beginning, that the coming days would test us in ways we could not yet imagine. And I knew that the house, once full of warmth and laughter, was now a stage for emotions that were raw, unfiltered, and slowly, almost imperceptibly beginning to pull us apart. And as I looked around, I felt a mixture of fear and love, fear for the fractures I could already see and love for the people I had always trusted most. And I resolved silently to do everything I could to hold on, to keep the fragile threads connecting us from snapping completely. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I understood something profound. Grief changes everything, but it also reveals what we are made of. And in that revelation,
painful though it may be, there is a chance to see ourselves, our family, and our bonds with a clarity we had never had before. And I clung to that thought, hoping it would be enough to carry us through the first days without her, hoping it would guide my steps as I navigated a house that suddenly felt both familiar and unrecognizable. And knowing that in order to survive this, I would have to face not only the loss of my mother, but the unraveling of everything we had taken for granted about our closeness, our understanding, and the quiet certainty that we would always have each other. And I sat there, holding on to that fragile hope, listening to the faint echoes of our mother's presence in the house, and feeling for the first time the full weight of the truth that life after her would never be the same.
After the funeral, the days that followed were a blur, each one folding into the next with a strange, heavy silence that seemed to fill every corner of the house. And I began to notice the little things that had gone unnoticed when Mom was alive, the way she left her slippers by the doorway, the way the curtains fell perfectly in the morning sun, the way the kitchen smelled faintly of the tea she brewed at the same hour every day. And seeing all of that without her presence made the house feel like a museum of memories, beautiful yet unbearably sad. And I found myself wandering from room to room, touching the objects she had touched, inhaling the faint scent of her perfume, and remembering the softness of her hands, the warmth of her voice, the way she could make even the simplest meal feel like a celebration. And I realized that these small routines, these little habits, were what had tied us together, what had made us feel safe and loved. And now they were reminders of what we had lost, of what we would never experience again. And I could feel a growing tension in the house, subtle at first, a flicker of discomfort, a hesitancy in the way my siblings moved, the way my brother cleared his throat before speaking, the way my sister's hands trembled slightly when she poured water for herself. And I wondered if they were feeling the same fear I felt, the same sense of fragility, the same knowledge that everything had changed. And we all tried, in our own ways, to maintain appearances, to smile politely, to ask each other how we were doing, without revealing the depth of the hurt that had settled like a shadow over us. But it was impossible to ignore the quiet moments where the distance between us could be measured in glances and silences. And I remembered sitting at the table one morning, watching my siblings in the muted sunlight, noticing the subtle ways their gestures betrayed their emotions. And I wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, to remind them that even without Mom, we still had each other. But every attempt I made was met with polite smiles or awkward nods, gestures that felt both caring and distant at the same time. And I realized that grief does strange things to people. It reshapes relationships, it brings out hidden tensions, it exposes insecurities that had been tucked away beneath love and habit. And even though I understood this intellectually, my heart ached to see the first cracks appearing in our bond, cracks that I knew could widen if left unchecked. And I remembered the afternoons we spent as children, when Mom would gather us in the living room, and the smell of her perfume would mingle with the warmth of the sun, and we would laugh over silly games, over small arguments that never lasted long, over stories she told with such patience and care that we believed in every word. And I realized that those moments had been the invisible glue that held us together, the quiet strength that prevented the small conflicts of life from growing into real distance. And now that she was gone, I could feel that glue dissolving slowly, leaving raw edges that were sharp and unfamiliar. And I wondered if any of us knew how to navigate this new reality, this house without her guidance, this family without her warmth, this love without the anchor of her presence. And I felt a strange mixture of sadness and fear, a longing to hold on to what had been, and a cautious awareness that the days ahead would test us in ways we had never imagined. And I spent hours in my room, sitting by the window, staring out at the street, noticing how everything seemed unchanged. The same trees, the same sidewalks, the same sunlight, and yet nothing felt the same, because we had changed, because our perceptions of each other had shifted, because grief had revealed the invisible threads and cracks that had always existed, but had been hidden beneath her love,
beneath her careful attention to our needs. And I thought about the arguments we sometimes had as children, small disagreements that Mom smoothed over. And now without her, even the smallest disagreements felt larger, heavier, more threatening. And I caught myself worrying about what might happen if we let these tensions grow, if we allowed resentment, pride, or fear to take root. And I remembered the way my brother sometimes avoided looking at me, the way my sister's smile felt forced, the way our conversations had shortened, the way politeness had taken the place of closeness. And I wondered if we could survive this, if we could find a way to honor Mom by staying connected, by holding on to the love she had given us so freely. And even as I asked myself these questions, I could feel a flicker of hope, a determination to be the one who reached out, who tried first, who reminded them that despite everything, we were still family, still siblings, still bound by memories, by shared experiences, by the invisible love that had been cultivated for decades. And I realized that the work of staying together would not be easy, that it would require patience, courage, and vulnerability. Things that grief sometimes robs us from, but also sometimes reveals in surprising ways. And I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, knowing that it was up to each of us to decide whether our bond would survive, whether love would outlast sorrow, and whether we could find our way back to each other in a house that suddenly felt both familiar and strange, comforting and fragile, filled with echoes of laughter that no longer existed but could still guide us if we were willing to listen. And so I began, quietly, slowly, to reach out, to start small conversations, to share memories, to ask questions, to remind my siblings that Mom's presence was gone, but her love, her lessons, and her care could still live in the way we treated each other, in the way we spoke, in the way we remembered. And even though the days felt long and the nights felt heavier, I resolved to do everything I could to nurture those bonds, to prevent them from breaking, to hold on to the love she had spent a lifetime shaping. And I knew it would be a journey, a slow and difficult journey, but it was one worth taking, because the alternative, letting the fractures grow, letting grief divide us completely, was a path I could not bear to follow. As the days passed, I began noticing patterns in my siblings' behavior that I had never truly paid attention to before. Small things that now seemed amplified in the absence of Mom, like the way my brother would linger over a cup of tea for no reason, staring at the floor, or the way my sister would straighten objects on the shelves obsessively, as if the act of arranging them could restore some sense of control over the chaos we were all feeling inside. And I realized that grief had a way of manifesting itself in subtle ways, shaping our habits, our moods, our words, and our silences. And sometimes it brought out kindness and empathy, and sometimes it revealed impatience and irritability, things that had been dormant but now stirred to the surface. And I found myself caught between wanting to comfort them and wanting to retreat, because the tension in the house was palpable, like a current running just beneath the surface of our interactions, a current that made every glance loaded, every smile hesitant, and every question a potential spark. And I remembered the night I tried to speak to my brother, asking about Mom's favorite recipes, hoping to share a memory, and he responded with a curt nod and a half smile, and I could feel a pang of hurt, but I reminded myself that he was grieving too, in his own way, and perhaps his distance was not personal but protective, a way of shielding himself from emotions too heavy to carry. And I thought about the years we had spent growing up, the laughter and arguments, the bedtime stories and whispered secrets, and I felt a wave of longing for the simplicity of those days, when our biggest worry was a broken toy or a forgotten homework assignment. And now everything felt larger, more complex, and infinitely more fragile. And I could see my sister pacing the hallway, her hands clasped tightly together, her face drawn, and I knew she was wrestling with her own feelings of loss, guilt, and confusion. And I wanted to reach out to her, to ask if she wanted to talk, to say that it was okay to feel sad, to feel angry, to feel lost. But something held me back, a fear that my words might be wrong, but they might upset her, that I might say the wrong thing. And in that hesitation, I felt the growing weight of isolation, a sense that even in our shared grief, we were beginning to drift apart, that the invisible threads that had held us together were fraying. And I remembered Mom's gentle voice telling me once that communication is the lifeline of family, that even the smallest words can mend what seems broken. And I resolved to remember that now, to try, to reach out, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it felt awkward, because doing nothing was a guarantee of distance, of silence, of a widening gap that might never close. And I started small, asking my brother about a particular vase that she had loved, the one she kept on the windowsill. And when he responded with a quiet story about how she had received it as a gift long ago, I felt a glimmer of connection, a spark that reminded me that beneath the grief, beneath the sadness, the bond was still there, waiting to be nurtured, waiting to be acknowledged. And I realized that these small moments of shared memory, these gentle gestures of attention and care, were more important now than ever, because they were the glue that could prevent us from becoming strangers to each other, even as the pain of losing Mom tried to pull us apart. And I remembered another afternoon when my sister and I found ourselves in the kitchen, our hands brushing as we reached for the same bowl. And instead of recoiling, we shared a quiet laugh, a small acknowledgement that we were still connected, that even in sorrow, love could survive. And I held on to that feeling, recognizing it as fragile yet vital. And I began to pay attention more, noticing the subtleties of how we moved in the house, the rhythms of our grief, the pauses in our conversations. And I tried to adapt, to meet them halfway, to offer support without expectation, and slowly
I could see slight changes, small openings, little moments where walls began to crumble, where a shared memory sparked a smile, where a kind word was returned in kind. And I cherished those moments, knowing they were delicate, knowing they required patience and persistence. And I reflected on the evenings when we all sat quietly in the living room, each absorbed in our own thoughts. The weight of absence pressing down on us, and yet the very act of being together, even in silence, felt comforting, like a reminder that we were still siblings, still family, still capable of understanding and empathy. And I realized that the work of mourning was not just about remembering Mom, but about remembering how to be with each other, how to nurture the bonds that she had cultivated, how to recognize and respond to the subtle needs of those who shared our loss. And I thought about the times in childhood when a small gesture, a shared joke, or a kind word could heal a hurt. And I understood that those lessons, learned so long ago, were still relevant, still powerful, still able to guide us through the uncertain terrain of grief. And I made a quiet promise to myself that I would continue to reach out, to continue to nurture those connections, to not let the absence of Mom destroy what she had spent a lifetime creating. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the room, I felt a small sense of hope, fragile but present, that even though everything had changed, we could find our way. We could hold on to each other, and we could survive together in a world that suddenly felt larger, colder, and infinitely more uncertain than it had before. I began noticing that even the simplest interactions with my siblings had become exercises in caution, small moments where the wrong word or an unguarded expression could cause unintended tension. And I realized that grief had not only altered our emotions, but had subtly shifted the dynamics between us, making each conversation a delicate balancing act, a dance of empathy and restraint. And I spent long afternoons observing, listening, and learning these new rhythms, trying to understand how each of us processed loss. And I found myself reflecting on past conflicts, wondering if the seeds of distance had always existed, hidden beneath the comfort of Mom's presence, unnoticed because her love had softened the edges. And now that she was gone, those edges were sharper, more distinct, cutting into the spaces between us. And I felt a growing awareness that the family I had taken for granted, the ease of our interactions, the unspoken understanding that had always existed, was no longer guaranteed. And I needed to be intentional, to choose my words carefully, to reach out with patience, and to acknowledge the subtle emotional currents that ran through the house, because even small misunderstandings could escalate into lasting rifts. And I remembered the first evening after Mom's funeral, when my brother and I sat in the living room, both of us avoiding eye contact, the television on but muted, and the silence was almost unbearable.
Yet in that silence I felt a strange closeness, a shared acknowledgement of our grief, and I wanted to speak, to say something, anything to break the tension. But the words felt heavy, laden with potential for a misinterpretation, and I held them back, realizing that sometimes just being present was enough. Sometimes silence carried more understanding than words ever could. And I thought about the quiet nights we had spent as children, when Mom's presence filled the room with warmth, and even our silences were comforting because we were together, and I longed to recreate that feeling, to find a way for silence to be healing rather than isolating. And I began to make small efforts, leaving a note on the kitchen counter for my sister, a simple message. "I'm thinking of you. I miss her too." And when I saw her glance at it, her eyes softening for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real, a reminder that even amidst sorrow, connection was possible. And I started leaving little reminders for my brother as well. Small gestures, a cup of tea ready when I knew he would arrive, a comment about a memory we shared of Mom, anything that could bridge the quiet spaces between us. And I could see subtle shifts, small changes, moments where tension eased, where polite nods turned into brief smiles. And I cherished those moments, knowing that grief was not linear, that progress could be measured in inches rather than miles. And I reminded myself to be patient, to understand that each of us carried our own burdens, that empathy sometimes meant waiting, listening, offering support without demanding acknowledgement in return. And I found solace in writing down my feelings, keeping a journal of my observations, my memories, my reflections on how our family was evolving in these days without Mom. And reading it back, I could see patterns, small victories, small setbacks, and I realized that maintaining our bond required attention, effort, and an awareness of the fragile emotional ecosystem in our home. And I felt a sense of responsibility settle on me, a quiet determination that I would not let grief divide us, that I would be intentional in my love. And I remembered the afternoons we spent baking together, the scent of fresh bread filling the house, the flour on Mom's hands, the laughter as we measured ingredients. And I imagined recreating those moments, even in small ways, as a way of honoring her, of reinforcing our connections. And I tried, carefully, to initiate shared meals, casual conversations, reminiscing about stories only we could remember. And slowly, the atmosphere in the house began to shift, small glimpses of warmth returning, subtle gestures of affection re-emerging, a reminder that even in loss, we could find pathways to each other. And I learned that grief could be both isolating and uniting, that sorrow could push people apart or bring them closer, and that it required conscious effort to ensure it did not destroy the bonds we held most dear. And as I sat by the window one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, I felt a mixture of sadness and hope, realizing that while the absence of Mom had created a void, it also provided an opportunity, a challenge, a chance to rebuild our family connections, to reaffirm our love, and to find new ways to be close. And I made a quiet promise to myself, a promise to keep reaching, keep connecting, keep nurturing these fragile threads, because even amidst the deepest sorrow, there was room for healing, for reconciliation, and for the kind of love that endures, even after the person who held it most dearly is gone. By the end of the first week after Mom's passing, I began noticing that the small routines we once shared had either disappeared or taken on a different meaning, like how my brother would linger over his coffee, staring out the window as if trying to hold on to memories he could not reach, and my sister would repeatedly adjust the cushions on the sofa, a silent attempt to create order in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. And I realized that grief was not only reshaping our emotions, but the way we moved through the house, the way we related to one another, and the way we remembered Mom. And I felt a subtle anxiety settle in my chest, a worry that these new patterns could harden into distance if we were not careful. And so I continued my small efforts, leaving gentle notes, preparing a shared meal, bringing up moments from the past that made us smile, and observing closely the ways my siblings responded, noting the smallest changes, a softened gaze, a hesitant laugh, a pause before speaking. And I recognized that these were signs of openings, opportunities to maintain the bond we had, and I clung to them, knowing that rebuilding closeness would require patience, attention, and empathy. And I also began reflecting on my own grief, acknowledging the sorrow I carried, the fear of losing connection with my siblings, the guilt for moments when I felt impatient or frustrated. And I reminded myself that acknowledging my own emotions was as important as recognizing theirs, because only by understanding myself could I truly support them. And I began setting aside quiet moments each day to sit with my feelings, to write them down, to allow tears if they came, to feel the sadness without letting it overwhelm me. And in doing so, I found a small reserve of calm that helped me approach my siblings with gentleness. And I could see the subtle effects: a slight easing of tension in the room, a softening of expressions, a willingness to share memories aloud, even if only for briefly. And I cherished these moments, recognizing them as fragile but meaningful, proof that life could endure, even through grief, even through fear, even through the uncertainty of life without Mom. And I realized that the work of mourning was not only about processing loss, but about cultivating resilience, patience, and compassion within the family. And I began noticing how our shared grief could sometimes act as a bridge, bringing us together in small ways: a glance, a shared story, a gentle touch. And I held on to these moments like precious threads, careful not to let them slip away. And I also observed the challenges, the subtle misunderstandings, the moments when frustration flared or emotions were misread. And I understood that these were natural, that grieving was complicated, and that maintaining connection required conscious effort. And so I continued my small acts of care, offering to help with chores, preparing tea for my sister, asking my brother about a memory he cherished. And I saw small openings in return, small gestures of acknowledgement, and I felt a mixture of relief and hope, fragile but real, that our family bond could endure if nurtured with love and patience. And I reflected on the lessons Mom had taught me, about empathy, about noticing the unspoken, about the importance of kindness and attention in relationships. And I realized that honoring her memory meant applying these lessons, even now, in the delicate and complicated landscape of grief.
And I spent long evenings observing the quiet interactions, noticing how small acts of care could transform tension into warmth, distance into closeness, silence into shared understanding. And I made a mental map of these interactions, learning how to navigate the new emotional terrain of our household. And in doing so, I discovered that grief, while painful, could also teach us about the depth of our love, the resilience of our family, and the capacity for connection that exists even in the hardest times. And as the week came to an end, I felt a cautious optimism, a fragile hope that with continued effort, patience, and understanding, we could begin to rebuild the closeness we had once taken for granted. That we could honor Mom by maintaining the bonds she had cultivated so carefully, and that even in her absence, her love could continue to guide us, shape us, and sustain us. And I made a quiet, determined promise to myself to keep reaching out, to keep connecting, to keep nurturing the love between us, no matter how difficult, no matter how heavy the days became, because the alternative, the slow unraveling of our family, was a path I could not bear to follow. And so I held on to hope, fragile yet steadfast, ready to continue the work of keeping us together in the days, months, and years to come. As the weeks passed, I began noticing the subtle tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface, now rising more clearly, small disagreements that once would have been brushed aside, now carrying weight and emotion that neither of us had expected. And I could see the way grief magnified even minor irritations, making them seem larger, sharper, more important. And it started with little things, like the way my brother would leave dishes in the sink despite knowing I planned to wash them, or the way my sister would correct small details of conversation, insisting she remembered events differently than I did. And I felt my patience wearing thin, a quiet frustration building inside me, because these were the moments that revealed how differently we each processed the absence of Mom. And I knew that the love we shared was still there, but grief was testing it, stretching it, exposing the corners where it had always been fragile. And I began to notice the small, unspoken judgments that surfaced in our interactions. The quick glances, the subtle shifts in tone, the pauses that carried more meaning than words ever could. And I realized that communication alone was not enough, that we would have to learn to navigate each other's brief, to meet halfway, to recognize the pain behind every expression and every gesture. And it was not easy, because grief is messy, unpredictable, and profoundly personal. And I found myself caught between empathy and frustration, between wanting to support my siblings and feeling the strain of carrying both my own sorrow and theirs. And one afternoon, a seemingly trivial disagreement over who would handle a small household task spiraled unexpectedly. The words sharper than intended, the tone defensive. And suddenly, the room felt heavy, thick with unsaid feelings. And I could see it in their eyes too, the mixture of hurt, frustration, and guilt. Each of us aware of our own pain, but unsure how to acknowledge the others without creating more tension. And I remember thinking, in that moment, how fragile our family had become, how easily the bonds Mom had nurtured could fray if we were not careful. And I began to notice patterns, recurring themes in our interactions, the way avoidance had become a coping mechanism, the way politeness sometimes masked resentment. The laughter was cautious, measured, as if we were all testing each other to see if we could still trust one another with our emotions. And I realized that grief had not only changed our individual hearts, but had shifted the balance between us, altering dynamics that seemed permanent. And I felt a quiet alarm, a sense that if we did not consciously work to maintain connection, the subtle cracks could widen, creating distance that might never be repaired. And I remembered a particular evening when my brother mentioned a memory of Mom that he cherished. And I offered a gentle correction about a small detail, not to undermine him, but to share the memory as I remembered it. And his face tightened, a brief flash of irritation. And I felt a pang of guilt and sadness, realizing that even our shared love for her could become a source of tension, that grief made us hypersensitive, defensive, and quick to misinterpret. And I began to see that this was not about right or wrong, but about emotion, about the way loss reshaped our perceptions and reactions. And I tried to respond with patience, taking deep breaths, offering reassurance, softening my tone. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it did not. And the unpredictability was exhausting, both emotionally and mentally. And I started keeping track of moments like these, quietly observing, reflecting on what caused tension, what eased it, what words or gestures brought comfort. And I realized that I was learning a new kind of emotional intelligence, a skill born of necessity, because navigating grief together required attention, awareness, and care. And it also required forgiveness, immediate and ongoing, for both ourselves and each other.
And one afternoon, a small argument over a misplaced photograph escalated, voices rising just slightly, eyes flashing, and the house felt charged, like electricity hanging in the air. And I felt my own pulse quicken, a mixture of fear, frustration, and sorrow coursing through me. And I remembered a moment from childhood when Mom would intervene, gently redirecting our emotions, reminding us to breathe, to speak kindly, to see beyond our own perspective. And I longed for that intervention now, but it was not there. And so I had to step into that role, reminding myself to pause, to soften my voice, to consider the impact of my words before I spoke. And slowly, carefully, I guided the conversation back to calm, helping my siblings and myself navigate the tension without letting it escalate further. And in that process, I realized how much we had relied on Mom to mediate not just practical matters, but the emotional currents that ran through our family. And now, without her, every conflict required more attention, more effort, more care, and I also began noticing that grief was not uniform, that my brother's anger sometimes masked deep sadness, that my sister's quietness sometimes hid fear or insecurity, and that my own reactions could unintentionally trigger theirs. And I understood that navigating these complexities would require ongoing awareness, empathy, and patience, because the risk of missteps was high, and the consequences of ignoring tension could be severe. And I committed myself to staying present, to observing, to listening, to offering care even when it was not asked for, to recognizing that the emotional landscape of our home had changed, and that only deliberate, gentle effort could preserve the connections that Mom had cultivated. And I held on to the small victories, the shared smile, the nod of understanding, the brief moment of laughter as proof that even amidst the rising conflict, love still persisted, fragile but enduring, and that with care and attention, we could navigate the challenges that grief had brought into our lives without losing each other completely. Over the following days, the tension in the house seemed to seep into every corner, subtle yet persistent, like a shadow that would not lift. And I noticed how small disagreements became indicators of deeper, unspoken emotions, the kind of feelings we all carried but struggled to articulate. And it became clear that grief was not only reshaping our moods, but also the way we interacted with one another, making each exchange a delicate negotiation, where a poorly chosen word could escalate into an argument or create distance. And I found myself walking on eggshells at times, uncertain how my actions or words might affect my siblings, yet also aware that avoidance was not a solution, because leaving things unsaid only allowed tension to fester. And I began to observe the subtle patterns. My sister's hands would fidget when she was anxious, my brother would pace before speaking, and both would sometimes retreat into their rooms for long stretches, shutting the door on both grief and conversation. And I understood that these behaviors were their way of coping, their way of managing emotions too heavy to bear openly, yet I also felt the strain it put on me, the loneliness of being physically close but emotionally distant. And I tried to find ways to bridge the gaps, offering small gestures of connection, sharing memories, suggesting walks, preparing meals, or simply sitting in the same room in silence, hoping that presence alone would convey understanding, empathy, and love. And at times it worked and at times it did not. And the unpredictability added another layer of emotional exhaustion, a constant undercurrent of worry and uncertainty. And I could feel the rising tension in moments that once would have been routine, like coordinating schedules for chores, discussing plans for mom's belongings, or deciding what items should be kept or donated. And these practical decisions suddenly carried emotional weight far beyond the material value, each choice interpreted as a reflection of care, respect, or even favoritism. And I realized that grief magnified every action, every word, every expression, and made us hyper-aware of perceived slights, both real and imagined. And I remember one particular afternoon when a conversation about mom's favorite chair turned into a heated debate, my sister insisting that it belonged in the living room where mom had always sat, my brother arguing that it should be placed in the sunroom where it would be appreciated more. And I found myself mediating, trying to acknowledge each perspective, keeping my voice calm, reminding them that we all loved mom and that honoring her memory was more important than any single decision. And slowly, tensions eased. Yet I could see the lingering frustration in their eyes, the unspoken "I'm right and you're wrong" undercurrents. And I understood that this was just one of many small conflicts that would arise, each a test of our ability to maintain connection, empathy, and patience. And I reflected on how these disagreements were not born out of malice, but out of grief, fear, and the desire to protect memories that felt fragile and irreplaceable. And I realized that recognizing the emotional roots of conflict was essential to navigating it without creating lasting damage. And I began keeping a mental note of triggers, responses, and outcomes, trying to learn the unspoken rules of our new family dynamic. And I also noticed how past grievances, minor sibling disagreements from years ago, seemed to resurface now, amplified by our emotional vulnerability, the old wounds reopening in the context of new loss. And I felt the weight of history pressing on every present interaction, complicating the grief process and making it harder to respond with clarity, patience, and kindness. And I understood that navigating these dynamics would require conscious effort, deliberate reflection, and continuous practice, and that the stakes were high because mismanaged emotions could create permanent rifts. And I felt a growing sense of responsibility to maintain harmony not only for my own peace, but for the long-term cohesion of our family. And so I kept practicing, testing approaches, observing results, adjusting my behavior, always aware that empathy and patience were essential. And slowly I began to notice small improvements. A softened tone, a brief smile, a willingness to discuss memories without conflict. And these small victories felt like proof that connection was possible even amidst the rising conflict, and that our love for each other, though tested, could endure. And I clung to these moments, nurturing them carefully, because they were fragile, and I knew that sustaining them required ongoing attention, intentionality, and the courage to face difficult emotions rather than hiding from them.
As time went on, I began to notice how grief was slowly altering not only our interactions, but our individual behaviors. The ways we moved through the house, the pauses in conversation, the hesitations before speaking, and I realized that even the familiar spaces now felt charged with emotion, carrying memories and unspoken tensions that had previously been beneath the surface. And small disagreements began to feel heavier, like each one added a layer to an invisible weight pressing down on all of us. And I saw how my brother sometimes retreated into long walks, leaving me and my sister to navigate quiet hours alone.
and I understood that his absence was both protective and distancing, a coping mechanism that left space for reflection but also for misunderstanding. And my sister, in turn, seemed more rigid, more insistent on control over the household, as if maintaining order could stabilize the emotional chaos we were all experiencing. And I felt torn between understanding their coping mechanisms and feeling frustrated by the emotional gaps they created. And I began to keep a closer eye on patterns, noticing how particular topics, mom's belongings, plans for holidays, even trivial memories could spark tension. And I realized that grief amplified sensitivity, making each conversation a potential minefield. And I had to navigate it with care, patience, and empathy, often taking deep breaths, pausing before speaking, choosing words carefully, and listening with full attention. And sometimes, even then, conflict erupted unexpectedly. A sharp word here, a defensive gesture there, and I had to quickly remind myself that the emotions behind the words were complex, layered with sadness, guilt, regret, and longing, and that responding with anger or frustration would only make matters worse. And I also noticed moments where old sibling rivalries seemed to surface, minor disagreements from years past that had lain dormant now resurfacing under the pressure of loss. And I realized that grief did not exist in isolation, but interacted with every unresolved tension, magnifying the smallest issues into larger conflicts. And I understood that navigating this required a delicate balance of self-awareness, empathy, and patience, because any misstep could create lasting distance. And I felt a growing responsibility to act as a stabilizing presence, to mediate, to soften tensions, to offer reassurance, to model patience and care. And in doing so, I sometimes felt exhausted, carrying not only my own grief, but also the emotional labor of helping my siblings manage theirs. And yet I knew it was necessary because without effort, the bond we shared could erode under the weight of unexpressed feelings. And one evening, a minor argument over a photograph of mom led to tears, frustration, and silence. And I felt both sorrow and determination, recognizing that these moments were opportunities to bridge gaps, to encourage communication, to nurture understanding rather than allow distance to grow. And I began setting small rituals, gentle practices to maintain connection, like sharing a memory at the dinner table, asking questions with care, leaving notes of encouragement, or simply sitting together in quiet presence, allowing the emotional energy to settle without forcing conversation. And I saw how these small interventions sometimes worked, creating openings for empathy, moments of acknowledgement, and the gradual easing of tension. And I realized that patience was crucial, that progress was measured in subtle shifts rather than dramatic resolutions, and that the work of maintaining family bonds during grief was continuous, requiring awareness, intentionality, and constant attention. And I began to keep track mentally of what gestures, words, and actions fostered connection and which ones provoked distance, adjusting my approach accordingly, learning a new kind of emotional intelligence, one built not from theory, but from lived experience, observation, trial, and reflection. And as days turned into weeks, I began noticing small but significant improvements, brief smiles, softened tones, the willingness to share stories without argument. And I clung to these signs of hope, fragile but real, because they were proof that even amidst rising conflict, love could persist, bonds could endure, and careful attention, empathy, and patience could preserve the family unity that we so desperately needed. And I held on to this understanding, recognizing it as both a guide and a lifeline in the turbulent emotional landscape of grief. By the end of the second month after Mom's passing, the tension had settled into a subtle undercurrent, never fully disappearing, always present, influencing the way we spoke, moved, and even thought about each other. And I noticed that even moments of calm carried a hint of fragility, the quiet before a potential storm. And I understood that grief was a landscape we were all navigating differently, with different speeds, different needs, and different emotional tools. And I felt the weight of responsibility to observe, support, and intervene when necessary while also respecting their space and autonomy. And I began documenting small observations, noting what triggered arguments, what eased tension, what brought comfort, and what caused frustration. And I realized that this self-awareness was essential to preventing conflicts from escalating. Because even a minor misunderstanding could become a wedge if not addressed with care. And I also noticed that our past dynamics, sibling rivalries, competition for attention, unresolved disagreements from childhood were now amplified under the lens of grief, and that these old patterns, once manageable, now threatened to widen the distance between us. And I saw how my own responses could unintentionally trigger theirs, and how theirs could trigger mine. And I began consciously practicing patience, empathy, and reflective listening, giving space to emotions without judgment, acknowledging hurt without defensiveness, and gently guiding conversations toward understanding. And some days it worked, and some days it did not. And the unpredictability became a constant companion, a reminder that navigating grief was not linear, and that emotional stability required ongoing effort, observation, and adaptability. And I began noticing moments where connection broke through the tension, small acts of kindness, shared memories, gentle touches, or unspoken understanding, and I cherished them, knowing that they were evidence of resilience, proof that love could survive the most challenging circumstances. And I also noticed that sometimes we retreated into silence, not out of anger, but as a protective measure, a pause to process. And I learned to respect these silences, to honor the emotional boundaries each of us needed, and to approach them with patience and compassion, rather than frustration or judgment. And I could see that this careful balance was slowly teaching us new ways to communicate, to coexist, to support one another through grief without letting it divide us. And I felt a quiet pride in my siblings and myself for navigating these challenges, for continuing to show up, for continuing to care. And I realized that rising conflict did not mean the end of connection, but rather the beginning of a more conscious, deliberate, and resilient approach to family relationships. And I began to internalize the lesson that grief could test us, push us, and even expose the fragility of our bonds. But that with attention, patience, empathy, and care, it could also deepen our understanding of each other, strengthen our connections, and provide opportunities to grow closer even in the midst of sorrow. And I held on to these insights, carrying them into each conversation, each shared meal, each memory we recalled, knowing that the work of navigating grief and conflict was ongoing, that it required constant awareness and effort, but that the rewards, the maintenance of love, trust, and family bonds were worth every careful step. And as I reflected on the months since Mom's passing, I could see the subtle but meaningful progress, the signs of resilience, the glimpses of restored connection. And I realized that rising conflict was inevitable in grief, but it did not have to define us or our relationships, and that through deliberate, gentle effort, patience, and empathy, we could continue to hold on to one another, even as we navigated the most difficult emotions of our lives. And that hope, fragile but enduring, could persist alongside sorrow, guiding us toward reconciliation, understanding, and the quiet, steady rebuilding of the love that had always been at the heart of our family.
It was a quiet evening, the kind where the house seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with unspoken emotions, when everything seemed to shift, a moment that would mark the beginning of change, the turning point that neither of us could have anticipated. And it started with a simple question from my sister, quiet, tentative but charged with emotion. "Do you think Mom would have wanted us to fight like this?" And I felt my chest tighten, the words piercing through the haze of grief and conflict that had surrounded us for weeks. And I realized that she was asking more than a question about Mom's wishes. She was asking about us, about whether we could navigate our sorrow without losing each other entirely. And I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, knowing that any misstep could deepen the rift. And I responded softly, "I don't think she would want that. She always wanted us to stay close, even when we disagreed." And the tension in the room seemed to shift slightly, a flicker of understanding passing between us. And yet, the air remained heavy because we were all aware that the real challenges lay ahead. The difficult conversations we had been avoiding, the truths that were hard to face, the unspoken resentments that had accumulated over time. And as we sat together, the quiet was broken by my brother's sigh, long and low, carrying both sorrow and frustration. And he finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been holding back for too long. I can't pretend anymore that everything is okay." And I felt a mix of apprehension and relief because I knew that honesty, while difficult, was the only way forward. And I listened as he began to recount feelings he had kept buried, the guilt over moments when he felt he had failed Mom, the frustration at our inability to communicate effectively, the sadness at seeing us drift apart. And I could see my sister's eyes glisten with tears as she absorbed his words, recognizing the pain we were all carrying, the weight of grief amplified by distance and miscommunication. And I realized that this moment of openness, while uncomfortable, was a crucial step toward understanding, toward reconciliation, toward facing the truth of our emotions without letting them fester. And I shared my own feelings, admitting the fear, the loneliness, the guilt, the frustration that I had experienced, the moments when I wanted to withdraw but instead tried to reach out. And as we spoke, slowly, carefully, a shift occurred,
a recognition that the conflict we had been navigating was not rooted in malice, but in grief, in fear, in the overwhelming weight of loss that had altered our perceptions. And I noticed the subtle ways our body language began to soften. The shoulders relaxing, the gaze holding longer, the hands resting closer together. And I realized that acknowledging our emotions openly was beginning to dissolve the invisible barriers that had separated us. And yet, even as we spoke honestly, I sensed that more revelations were coming, truths that would be harder to hear. And I braced myself, knowing that facing them was necessary, that the turning point required courage, vulnerability, and trust. And I listened as my sister admitted moments of resentment, the times she had felt overlooked, unheard, or misunderstood. And I understood immediately that these feelings were not attacks but expressions of pain, long buried, and I responded with empathy, validating her experience, assuring her that I had never intended to hurt her, and that I too had carried unspoken emotions that had sometimes manifested as impatience or distance. And my brother nodded, acknowledging that he had felt similar misunderstandings. And as we continued to share, the room seemed to shift subtly, the heaviness easing just a fraction. And I realized that this was the essence of the turning point, the courage to confront uncomfortable truth, the willingness to be vulnerable, the commitment to understand each other even when it was difficult. And I remembered Mom's lessons about empathy, patience, and honesty, and I knew that applying them now was both a tribute to her memory and a necessity for our survival as a family. And I felt a cautious hope, fragile but present, that through openness and understanding, the distance that had grown between us could begin to close, that the love we shared, tested by grief and conflict, could endure, and that we could emerge from this period of tension stronger, wiser, and more connected. And as the evening continued, we kept speaking, sharing, listening, acknowledging, and forgiving, small steps that were building toward healing. And I realized that the turning point was not a single moment, but a process, a conscious decision to face emotions rather than avoid them, to embrace vulnerability rather than hide behind defensiveness, and to prioritize connection over ego, fear, or resentment. And I felt a quiet gratitude for this difficult but necessary journey, understanding that through this process we were learning how to hold on to each other, even in the depths of grief, and that the path forward, though challenging, was illuminated by the willingness to be honest, to be present, and to love despite fear and pain. The next few days were filled with both tension and tentative connection as we navigated the aftermath of that first honest conversation. And I noticed how even small gestures carried new weight. A gentle smile, a shared glance, a quiet acknowledgement of each other's presence. And I realized that turning points are rarely sudden. They often unfold gradually, like sunlight breaking through clouds. And yet, within that gradual shift, the emotional landscape of our family was beginning to change, subtle but meaningful. And I observed how my siblings started to express feelings they had previously suppressed, their voices softer, more reflective, sometimes hesitant, sometimes trembling with emotion. And I listened with care, knowing that this was a fragile moment, one that required patience and understanding. And I began to share memories of Mom that were tinged with both sorrow and joy, remembering her laughter, her advice, her gentle guidance. And I could see the effect on my siblings, the way their expressions softened, the way their eyes glistened with tears. And I understood that shared memories were not just comforting, they were bridges, connecting us through the grief that had threatened to isolate us. And yet, even as we connected, the weight of unresolved emotions remained, lurking beneath the surface like currents in a river, strong and unpredictable. And I realized that the turning point was as much about acknowledging these currents as it was about celebrating the moments of connection. And one evening, a disagreement arose over the division of Mom's personal belongings, items that carried deep emotional significance. And I could feel the familiar tension rising, my brother insisting on keeping certain mementos, my sister advocating for others. And I stepped in, reminding them that the goal was not to claim ownership, but to honor Mom's memory in a way that reflected her love for each of us. And as we spoke, the conversation shifted from confrontation to reflection, each of us expressing the memories tied to each item, the stories, the feelings, the significance. And in that moment, I realized that the true inheritance Mom had left us was not material but emotional. The lessons, the love, the shared experiences, the bonds that could endure even beyond her presence. And I felt a profound mix of sorrow and gratitude, recognizing that grief could teach us not only about loss, but also about connection, empathy, and understanding. And I noticed how our willingness to speak honestly and listen deeply was changing the dynamics of our interactions, softening old tensions, fostering new understanding, and creating space for forgiveness. And I also recognized my own mistakes, moments when my silence had contributed to misunderstandings, when my impatience had exacerbated conflict. And I made a quiet, internal commitment
to approach each interaction with care, awareness, and empathy, knowing that rebuilding trust required consistent effort. And over the course of that week, we continued these conversations, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with tears, always with honesty. And I began to see the emerging patterns of our healing: shared stories, acknowledgement of emotions, active listening, gentle corrections, and small acts of support. And I felt a sense of hope, fragile but real, that the bonds between us could be restored, strengthened even, through this process. But I remained aware that turning points are not linear, that moments of progress can be followed by setbacks, that grief can be unpredictable, and that maintaining connection required ongoing attention, deliberate effort, and conscious reflection. And I noticed one afternoon that my sister lingered in the kitchen after a conversation, hesitant to leave, her expression thoughtful. And she said softly, "I think I've been holding back too much. I'm sorry for shutting down." And I felt a wave of relief and warmth, recognizing that apology and acknowledgement were critical steps in our turning point. And I reassured her that I understood, that we were all learning to navigate emotions in the aftermath of loss. And my brother nodded from the doorway, silently echoing the sentiment. And in that quiet, unspoken agreement, I felt a sense of shared understanding, a connection that had been threatened by grief, but was now being consciously rebuilt, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, moment by moment. And I realized that this turning point, while emotionally challenging, was also profoundly healing, teaching us to face our pain, express our emotions, and support one another in ways we had never before experienced. And that by embracing honesty, vulnerability, and empathy, we were finding a path through grief that would allow love and connection to endure. And I felt the weight and the beauty of this realization, knowing that the journey was ongoing, that the turning point was a process rather than a single moment, and that each step we took together strengthened the bonds that mattered most, guiding us toward understanding, reconciliation, and a deeper, more resilient family connection.
The days that followed were a delicate balance between progress and fragility, moments of connection interspersed with waves of tension, and I began to understand that turning points are rarely dramatic. They are quiet, unfolding gradually, with small gestures, small words, and small acknowledgments accumulating into meaningful change. And I noticed that my siblings and I began to anticipate each other's emotional needs more intuitively, pausing before speaking to consider the impact of our words, offering comfort without prompting, and creating space for one another to process grief at our own pace. And I felt a mixture of pride and relief, recognizing that despite the pain and distance that had developed, we were capable of rebuilding trust, empathy, and understanding. And yet, even amidst these small victories, underlying fears and insecurities occasionally resurfaced, testing our patience and emotional resilience. And one evening, a disagreement arose over a letter from Mom that had been found among her personal effects, and its contents sparked old insecurities and feelings of inadequacy. And I could sense the familiar tension building, a reminder that turning points are not immune to setbacks, and that progress can be interrupted by unresolved emotions. And I stepped in gently, encouraging us to reflect on the meaning of the letter, to consider Mom's intentions and love, and to approach the situation with empathy for one another. And as we spoke, the atmosphere softened, the conversation shifting from defensiveness to reflection, and I noticed how our willingness to remain calm, to listen, and to validate each other's emotions allowed the tension to dissipate. And I realized that these moments of challenge were also opportunities for growth, teaching us to navigate conflict with care and intention, and to prioritize connection over pride or ego. And over the following week, we continued these practices, establishing routines of communication and shared reflection, acknowledging emotions openly, expressing gratitude for one another, and offering reassurance when misunderstandings arose. And I observed how small rituals, like sharing tea while recounting memories of Mom, or taking a short walk together to discuss difficult topics, began to strengthen our emotional bonds. And I could feel the tension between us easing gradually, replaced by a sense of mutual understanding and support. And yet, the turning point was not without difficulty, as moments of doubt, frustration, and sorrow still emerged, reminding me that emotional healing is a continuous process, requiring patience, vigilance, and consistent effort. And I reflected on how each of us was learning new ways to express vulnerability, to ask for help, and to respond with empathy.
And I recognized that this was perhaps the most profound aspect of the turning point, the willingness to face emotions honestly, to acknowledge pain without judgment, and to rebuild connections with care. And I felt a deep sense of gratitude that my siblings and I had arrived at this place where we could engage with one another authentically, even when emotions were raw. And I realized that the turning point was as much about internal growth as it was about interpersonal reconciliation, that by confronting our own vulnerabilities and limitations, we were better equipped to support one another and to maintain the bonds that had been tested by grief and conflict. And one afternoon, as we sat together sorting through Mom's belongings, I noticed my brother pause, his eyes misty, and he whispered, "I never realized how much I needed this, how much I needed to feel close to you both again." And I felt a lump in my throat, a mixture of sadness, relief, and hope. And my sister reached out, gently holding his hand, acknowledging the sentiment without words. And I understood in that moment that the turning point was not a single event, but an accumulation of efforts, honesty, and emotional presence, the steady work of reconnecting, healing, and rebuilding trust. And I felt a quiet certainty that, although grief would continue to challenge us, we now possess the tools, patience, empathy, understanding, and communication to face it together, and that our family, though tested, was learning to emerge from sorrow with greater resilience, love, and awareness. And I held on to this realization as a guiding light, understanding that the turning point, while difficult and at times painful, had opened the door to a deeper, more conscious, and enduring connection between us, one that could sustain us through the remainder of our grief and beyond. As the weeks progressed, the impact of our honesty and openness became increasingly evident, a quiet transformation that changed the rhythm of our home and the texture of our interactions. And I noticed that small gestures, offering a cup of tea without prompting, lingering a moment longer in conversation, gently checking in on one another's emotional state, began to carry profound significance. And I realized that the turning point was no longer a single moment, but a series of conscious choices, repeated daily, that were reshaping the emotional landscape of our family. And even though grief remained present, its intensity was tempered by understanding, connection, and empathy. And I observed how my siblings began to anticipate each other's needs, pausing before speaking, offering reassurance, and creating space for vulnerability. And I recognized that these behaviors, though subtle, were evidence of lasting change, the cultivation of trust, patience, and emotional intelligence in response to shared loss. And yet the process was not without challenge, as moments of tension occasionally resurfaced, triggered by memories, reminders, or old unresolved conflicts. And I learned that navigating these moments required continuous awareness, reflection, and deliberate responses. And I felt both the weight and the beauty of this responsibility, understanding that the turning point was as much about internal growth as it was about relational reconciliation. And one evening, during a quiet discussion about Mom's personal letters, we encountered a particularly painful passage, one that touched on regrets, missed opportunities, and unspoken feelings. And I could sense the vulnerability and raw emotion it evoked. And I guided my siblings gently, encouraging reflection and acknowledgement, and reminding them that grief is complex, that emotions are not wrong, and that expressing them openly was a step toward healing, rather than a threat to connection. And as we worked through the emotional weight of the letters, I noticed a remarkable shift. The tension that had previously seemed insurmountable was dissolving, replaced by understanding, compassion, and a renewed commitment to one another. And I realized that the turning point was cumulative, the result of repeated acts of courage, honesty, empathy, and patience, and that by facing uncomfortable truths and acknowledging our vulnerabilities, we were able to create a foundation for enduring connection. And I reflected on my own growth, recognizing moments where I had faltered, where my silence or impatience had contributed to conflict, and I committed to being more mindful, present, and compassionate, knowing that the work of turning a family toward healing requires constant attention, deliberate effort, and unwavering commitment. And as days turned into weeks, I observed how our shared grief transformed into shared understanding, moments of laughter returning amidst tears, conversations flowing with honesty and care. And I felt a quiet gratitude for the resilience, empathy, and patience that my siblings and I were cultivating together. And I understood that while grief would continue to challenge us, the turning point had given us the tools to navigate it together, to maintain love and connection even when emotions were raw and difficult. And I held on to this realization as a guiding principle, a reminder that facing pain directly, embracing vulnerability, and committing to empathy and understanding could transform conflict into connection, distance into intimacy, and sorrow into a deeper appreciation for the bonds that define family. And in that moment, I felt a profound sense of hope. Fragile but real, a knowledge that though the road ahead would not be without challenge, our willingness to confront our emotions, communicate openly, and care for one another had created a path forward, one where love, trust, and understanding could endure, guiding us through the remainder of our grief and beyond. And I carried this awareness quietly in my heart, knowing that the turning point, though difficult and at times painful, had been the catalyst for healing, growth, and a renewed commitment to family, a lesson I would carry with me for the rest of my life, and that in embracing it, we had not only honored Mom's memory, but had also discovered a deeper, more resilient way to love, support, and be present for one another.
In the days following our turning point, a new rhythm settled into our home, subtle but noticeable, a quiet sense of understanding and connection that had previously felt impossible. And I observed how my siblings and I began to approach one another with renewed patience, listening more attentively, speaking more deliberately, and offering support even in moments of minor disagreement. And I realized that resolution is not a single event, but a sustained practice, the consistent choice to prioritize empathy, love, and connection over pride, fear, or frustration. And I noticed how the simple act of sharing a memory of Mom could dissolve lingering tension, a story about her laughter, her wisdom, or her gentle guidance acting as a bridge between our hearts. And I began to recognize the patterns of our healing, the small but meaningful ways we repaired the gaps that grief and conflict had created. And I felt both relief and cautious hope, understanding that the past could not be undone. The present offered opportunities to rebuild trust, strengthen bonds, and nurture compassion. And one afternoon, as we sat together looking through old photo albums, I noticed the way my sister paused at a picture of Mom holding us as children, her eyes glistening, and she whispered, "I've missed this, missed feeling close to you both." And I felt the warmth of connection, the reassurance that our efforts to heal were working. And I responded softly, "I've missed it too." And my brother nodded quietly, silently affirming the sentiment. And I understood that these small moments, simple acknowledgments of emotion and shared experience, were the foundation of resolution, the proof that love could survive even the most challenging periods of grief and misunderstanding. And I began to see how our daily interactions reflected this new commitment. Shared meals, gentle check-ins, collaborative decisions about Mom's belongings, moments of humor amid sadness, and quiet conversations that acknowledged pain while affirming care. And I realized that resolution required balance, the willingness to honor grief without letting it dominate, to express vulnerability without fear of judgment, and to remain present for one another even when emotions were raw. And I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the resilience of my siblings, for their willingness to engage in difficult conversations, to listen, to forgive, and to embrace the slow, sometimes messy process of healing. And as we continued to navigate these days, I noticed subtler changes in the ways we spoke and acted, the tone of our voices softer, the pauses more thoughtful, the gestures more intentional. And I recognized that this was evidence of progress, proof that resolution is cultivated through consistent attention, empathy, and care. And I reflected on the ways I had grown as well, understanding that my own patience, awareness, and emotional presence had contributed to the shift, and that by committing to honesty, vulnerability, and understanding, I was helping to foster an environment where love and connection could flourish despite grief. And I observed how even moments of tension or disagreement were now approached with curiosity rather than defensiveness, reflection rather than reaction. And I realized that this shift represented a profound transformation, one in which conflict was no longer a threat to our bonds, but an opportunity to strengthen them through conscious, compassionate engagement. And I felt a quiet sense of pride in all of us, recognizing the courage it took to face difficult emotions, to acknowledge hurt, to express grief, and to actively work toward reconciliation. And as we moved through our routines, sharing tea, organizing Mom's belongings, recalling memories, offering comfort, I felt the weight of sorrow lifting just enough to allow space for connection, laughter, and a renewed sense of family. And I understood that resolution was not about erasing grief, forgetting loss, or pretending the past had not been painful, but about embracing the present with empathy, patience, and love, acknowledging both sorrow and joy, mistakes and forgiveness, and choosing to move forward together stronger, more aware, and more resilient than before. And in that awareness, I felt a subtle but powerful shift in my heart, a deep reassurance that despite the challenges we had faced, we were capable of maintaining love, trust, and understanding, and that the bonds between us, though tested, were now fortified by shared vulnerability, compassion, and deliberate effort, creating a foundation for a future that could honor Mom's memory while allowing us to live fully, deeply, and connectedly in the present. As the days unfolded, I began to notice subtler signs of healing in the way my siblings interacted with one another and with me. The ease of conversation returning slowly, like a river finding its natural course after a period of blockage. And I felt a quiet sense of relief, knowing that the work we had been doing, the honesty, the listening, the gentle acknowledgement of each other's pain, was producing tangible results. And I observed moments of tenderness that had previously seemed impossible. A shared smile over a memory of Mom, a hand gently placed on a shoulder during a difficult discussion, a pause to let each other speak fully without interruption. And I realized that resolution is built in these seemingly small, ordinary acts, cumulative and powerful in their effect. And I reflected on the lessons that grief had taught us, that pain could drive division if left unaddressed, but could also create opportunities for empathy, understanding, and emotional growth if met with honesty and care. And I noticed how we began to anticipate each other's needs without being asked, offering comfort, reassurance, or practical help, a quiet attentiveness that was both healing and humbling. And I felt gratitude for these moments, understanding that they were fragile and required continued presence, patience, and conscious effort. And yet, even as we experienced these improvements, grief continued to surface in unexpected ways, old wounds reopening with memories, triggers, and reflections on what had been lost. And I saw that resolution is not a one-time achievement, but an ongoing practice, a daily choice to respond with compassion, understanding, and love rather than frustration, defensiveness, or withdrawal. And I reflected on how my own behavior had changed, my patience more deliberate, my listening more active, my responses more considered. And I understood that this personal growth was as essential to the process as the shared efforts of my siblings. And one afternoon, we faced another challenge when a disagreement arose over the distribution of Mom's personal letters and keepsakes, items that carry deep emotional resonance and individual significance. And I noticed the familiar tension threatening to resurface, the old defensive patterns creeping back into our words and gestures. And I reminded us all to pause, to take a breath, to speak slowly, and to acknowledge the emotions behind the requests. And as we navigated the conversation, we discovered that our ability to communicate with empathy had strengthened remarkably, that we could listen without judgment, validate feelings without needing to agree on every detail, and find compromises that honored each of our connections to Mom. And I felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment, realizing that the difficult work we had undertaken was yielding real results, a newfound ability to confront sensitive topics without letting grief or resentment dominate. And I saw how these experiences were building resilience, a capacity to navigate the complexities of emotion, memory, and family bonds with awareness and care. And I reflected on the subtle ways our interactions had evolved, laughter returning amidst tears, shared responsibilities approached with cooperation rather than contention, moments of reflection creating space for healing.
And I felt a deep sense of pride in my siblings and in myself, recognizing the courage, patience, and compassion that each of us had demonstrated. And I understood that resolution is both a personal and collective process, requiring individual accountability and mutual support. And I noticed how the simple act of acknowledging one another's feelings, saying, "I understand," or "I hear you," was profoundly transformative, allowing us to move past misunderstandings and to reconnect authentically. And as I observed these changes, I felt a renewed appreciation for the resilience of the human heart, the capacity for empathy, the importance of presence, and the strength of bonds that can endure even after loss and conflict. And I held on to this understanding as a guiding principle, a reminder that the journey toward emotional healing is ongoing, that it requires vigilance, commitment, and compassion, and that by embracing these practices, we could navigate grief, honor Mom's memory, and nurture the relationships that mattered most to us.
In the following weeks, I noticed that the atmosphere in our home was gradually shifting, a subtle warmth replacing the cold distance that had settled between us after Mom passed. And I realized that resolution is not always loud or dramatic. It often manifests quietly, in the way we choose to listen, in the patience we extend, in the moments of shared reflection and understanding that occur without announcement. And I began to observe how my siblings were embracing these moments with sincerity, offering small gestures of care and concern, pausing to consider the impact of their words, and allowing space for emotions to be expressed fully without interruption or judgment. And I felt a sense of relief that we were developing healthier patterns of interaction, patterns that honored grief while creating opportunities for connection and growth. And one evening, while sorting through Mom's belongings, my sister lingered on a particular photograph, a candid shot of Mom laughing with us in the garden, and she said softly, "I think I've been so focused on what we lost that I forgot how much we still have." And I felt the weight of her words, a profound reminder that resolution involves recognizing what remains as well as what has been taken. And I responded gently, "We have each other, and that's something Mom would want us to cherish." And my brother, standing nearby, nodded silently. And I understood that these shared acknowledgments, these deliberate affirmations of connection and presence, were the foundation of our healing, a proof that grief need not divide us but can, when approached with care, deepen our understanding and compassion for one another. And as the days passed, I observed the ways in which old tensions that had seemed insurmountable were loosening, replaced by the ability to communicate with empathy, to compromise without resentment, and to honor both individual and collective needs. And I reflected on my own role in this process, recognizing the moments when my silence, impatience, or defensiveness had hindered our progress. And I committed to continuing with awareness, striving to respond with patience, empathy, and presence, knowing that these qualities were essential to sustaining the resolution we had begun to build. And I noticed that even minor challenges, disagreements over the allocation of Mom's possessions or memories, were now approached differently, with careful listening, thoughtful reflection, and a willingness to find solutions that respected everyone's feelings. And I felt a profound sense of growth, both personally and as a family, understanding that the process of resolution is ongoing, requiring continuous effort, conscious attention, and the willingness to remain emotionally present even when faced with discomfort or conflict. And I saw how this approach transformed our daily interactions, from shared meals and chores to conversations about Mom's life and legacy. And I felt a quiet sense of pride in the ways my siblings and I were navigating this difficult period with dignity, care, and emotional intelligence. And I realized that resolution is not about perfection, erasing mistakes, or eliminating grief, but about creating a space where emotions can be expressed authentically, where connection can be maintained despite past pain, and where love and understanding can flourish. And as I watched my siblings exchange gentle smiles, offer reassurance, and reflect on cherished memories, I felt a deep sense of hope and gratitude, recognizing that the bonds between us, though tested, were being intentionally rebuilt, strengthened by honesty, empathy, and shared commitment. And I understood that this period of resolution was preparing us for the future, equipping us with the emotional tools to navigate not only grief, but life's inevitable challenges. And I carried this awareness with me quietly, knowing that while the journey was ongoing, the foundations we were establishing now, through listening, patience, acknowledgement, and care, would sustain us, nurture our relationships, and honor the memory of Mom in ways that extended far beyond material inheritance, creating a family dynamic rooted in love, understanding, and the conscious choice to face life together.
In the days that followed, I began to notice a remarkable consistency in our interactions, a stability that had been missing since Mom passed. And I realized that the work of resolution is cumulative, built on repeated choices to listen, to empathize, to be present, and to respond with care even when emotions are raw. And I observed how my siblings now approach difficult topics with deliberate thoughtfulness, speaking honestly while also allowing space for reflection. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude that we had cultivated this environment of emotional safety, one where grief could be expressed without fear, where mistakes could be acknowledged without judgment, and where connection could be prioritized above pride or resentment. And I noticed how even moments of tension were handled differently, with patience, openness, and a willingness to forgive. And I understood that this approach was transforming not only our interactions, but also our individual capacity for emotional resilience. And one afternoon, while reviewing a box of Mom's handwritten notes, my sister paused, her eyes glistening with tears, and said softly, "I didn't realize how much I needed this closure, how much I needed to feel understood and supported." And I felt a lump in my throat, a mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. And I reassured her gently, "We're here for each other, and we always will be." And my brother nodded quietly, silently affirming the sentiment. And in that shared moment, I recognized that resolution is both a personal and collective journey, requiring attention to our own growth as well as the nurturing of relationships. And I reflected on the countless small decisions, the deliberate listening, the patient acknowledgement of emotions, the compromises and gestures of care that had accumulated to create this sense of healing. And I realized that resolution does not erase grief or undo the past, but instead provides a framework for navigating it with compassion, awareness, and connection. And I noticed how our daily routines had become infused with this newfound mindfulness, whether sharing a quiet meal, discussing Mom's belongings, recalling cherished memories, or simply checking in on one another. And I felt a quiet pride in the resilience and dedication of my siblings and myself, understanding that we had not only survived the aftermath of loss, but had intentionally transformed our relationships. And I observed the ways in which laughter had returned amidst tears, moments of tenderness punctuating our days, the rhythm of our household reflecting both grief and gratitude. And I recognized that these patterns of care and connection were the true markers of resolution, evidence that love and empathy could endure even in the shadow of loss. And I reflected on how our efforts had deepened our understanding of one another, fostering an emotional intimacy that had been strained by grief, but was now flourishing through honesty, patience, and compassion. And I felt a deep sense of hope for the future, knowing that while challenges would continue to arise, we had developed the tools, habits, and awareness to navigate them together, preserving the bonds that mattered most. And as I watched my siblings, sharing quiet smiles, gentle words, and the occasional tearful laugh, I understood that resolution is both a destination and a journey, the product of ongoing effort, deliberate presence, and shared vulnerability. And I carried this understanding with me as a quiet reassurance, a reminder that even in the aftermath of profound loss, relationships can be healed, trust can be restored, and love can endure. And I knew that by continuing to choose empathy, understanding, and connection every day, we would honor Mom's memory, nurture our bonds, and embrace the future together with strength, patience, and unwavering care. And in that realization, I felt a profound peace, the kind that comes from knowing that though grief changes us, it does not have to break us, and that through conscious effort, emotional awareness, and shared commitment, we had created a family dynamic rooted in love, resilience, and hope, one that would carry us forward through life's inevitable challenges while preserving the memory of the one who had shaped us, loved us, and guided us through every step of our journey.
As the weeks turned into months, a quiet sense of peace settled over our home, a calm I had not expected to find after the storm of grief and tension that followed Mom's passing. And I realized that endings are not always sudden or dramatic. They often arrive gently through moments of understanding, shared laughter, and the reassurance of connection. And I observed how my siblings and I had developed a rhythm, a balance between honoring our loss and embracing the life that continued around us. And I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the growth, patience, and empathy that had brought us to this place. And I noticed how simple gestures had become powerful symbols of our resilience, sharing a cup of tea in the morning, pausing to listen attentively, exchanging gentle words of encouragement, or simply sitting together in quiet reflection. And I understood that these small acts, repeated over time, were the true markers of an ending, a conclusion that honored both the past and the present. And I reflected on how much we had changed, individually and collectively, since those first days of raw grief, when anger, fear, and misunderstanding had threatened to divide us. And I marveled at our capacity for growth,
for empathy, and for reconciliation, recognizing that the emotional labor we had undertaken, the willingness to face pain, to express vulnerability, and to prioritize connection had transformed not only our relationships, but also our understanding of ourselves. And one evening, as we sat together watching the sun dip behind the horizon, casting soft amber light across the living room, my sister reached out and said softly, "I feel like we're finally finding our way back to each other." And I felt a lump in my throat, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and quiet joy. And I replied, "We've been working toward it every day, and I think we're finally here." And my brother nodded, his eyes glistening, silently affirming the sentiment. And in that moment, I realized that endings are not a conclusion of emotion or effort, but rather a transition, the delicate balance between acknowledging the past, embracing the present, and preparing for the future. And I reflected on the lessons that this journey had taught me, that grief is complex, that emotions are powerful, that misunderstandings can fracture even the strongest bonds, but that patience, empathy, and deliberate care can restore and even strengthen those bonds. And I understood that life's challenges are not simply obstacles, but opportunities for growth, understanding, and deeper connection. And I felt a deep sense of peace knowing that my siblings and I had not only survived the pain of loss, but had emerged with a stronger, more conscious commitment to one another. And I noticed how our conversations had shifted from defensiveness and tension to curiosity, openness, and affirmation, a reflection of the emotional maturity we had cultivated through consistent effort, shared reflection, and unwavering presence. And I realized that endings are measured not in dramatic gestures, but in the quiet, ongoing choices we make to remain present, to listen, and to love. And I felt a profound sense of hope, recognizing that while life will continue to present challenges, we now possess the emotional tools, understanding, and connection to navigate them together. And as I looked around the room, at the familiar faces of my siblings, I understood that the journey of healing is never complete, but that the path we have forged through patience, empathy, honesty, and love provides a foundation for enduring connection, resilience, and mutual support. And I held on to this awareness as a guiding principle, a quiet reassurance that though grief reshapes us, it does not define or limit the bonds of family. And I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the work we had undertaken had not only honored Mom's memory, but had also created a family dynamic rooted in care, understanding, and hope, one that would carry us forward through life's inevitable challenges with strength, presence, and love. In the following days, I found myself noticing the subtleties of our renewed connection even more, the way a glance could convey understanding, the way shared silence felt comforting rather than awkward, the way laughter returned naturally, soft and genuine, punctuating moments that had once felt heavy and tense. And I realized that endings are not just about closure, but about creating space for life, for presence, and for the quiet joys that grief can sometimes obscure. And I observed how my siblings and I had begun to embrace a kind of emotional mindfulness, checking in with each other, honoring feelings without judgment, and responding with care even in moments of discomfort. And I felt a deep sense of peace knowing that these practices were sustaining our bonds, nurturing both individual and collective healing. And I reflected on the journey that had brought us here, the initial shock of Mom's passing, the misunderstandings, the distance, the rawness of unprocessed grief, and then the deliberate choices to communicate, to listen, to forgive, and to embrace vulnerability. And I understood that each stage had been essential, a necessary part of the path toward genuine resolution and connection. And one evening, while looking through Mom's belongings one last time before putting them into storage, my brother turned to me and said quietly, "I feel like we're finally okay, like we're really together again." And I felt a wave of emotion, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and soft joy. And I replied, "Yes, we've come a long way and we'll keep moving forward together." And my sister reached over and squeezed my hand, her eyes shining, silently affirming the bond that had been tested but never broken. And in that moment, I realized that endings are not finite moments, but living processes, moments of awareness, reflection, and choice that accumulate over time, creating lasting change and deepened connection. And I reflected on the lessons that this journey had taught me, that grief cannot be rushed, that healing requires patience, that vulnerability is not weakness but strength, and that love, when nurtured with honesty, empathy, and care, can survive even the most painful trials. And I noticed how the ordinary rhythms of life, shared meals, casual conversations, moments of reflection, small gestures of support, had become infused with intention, love, and mindfulness, turning everyday experiences into opportunities for connection, understanding, and growth.
And I felt a profound sense of fulfillment, knowing that the bonds between my siblings and I were now stronger, more conscious and resilient than ever before, and I understood that the true measure of an ending is not the absence of grief, but the presence of love, understanding, and commitment. And I carried this understanding with me quietly, a reminder that life continues, that challenges will arise, but that the foundation we have built through patience, empathy, honesty, and shared effort will sustain us, guide us, and nurture the relationships that matter most. And as I watched the evening sky fade into a soft twilight, I felt a subtle but powerful gratitude for the journey, for the lessons learned, for the growth achieved, and for the bonds restored. And I knew that while grief will always be a part of our lives, it no longer has the power to divide us, to isolate us, or to diminish the love we share. And I felt a gentle hope, a quiet assurance that the future, though unknown, could be met together with resilience, understanding, and unwavering care. And I whispered softly to myself, "We are okay, we are together, and we will continue to be." And in that whispered affirmation, I felt the full weight and warmth of resolution, the delicate balance of honoring loss while embracing life, and the profound lesson that even after the deepest sorrow, love, connection, and hope can endure, guiding us forward with quiet strength, tenderness, and the assurance that family, when nurtured with care, patience, and understanding, remains an unbreakable, sustaining force in our lives.